de som var her i formiddag. Og velkommen til nye gjester. Mitt navn er Ole Solum. Jeg er fra Institutt for medier og kommunikasjon, som sammen med det italienske Kulturinstituttet og Cinemateket står for denne Sergio Leone-helgen. This is going to be in English. And the lecture will be by Professor Helge Rønning from the Department of Media and Communication. He has been a long fan of Sergio Leone and Italian film cinema in general. And I look very much forward to listen to you, Helge.
Thank you. Well, dear friends of Italian cinema, the hypothesis of what I'm going to talk about today, the title I've given to what I'm going to talk about is Genre and Sergio Leone. Yesterday we heard that one of the inspirations that you could find in the cinematography of Leone could be found in some of Salvador Dali's surrealist paintings from the same places that Sergio Leone also filmed some of his famous westerns. I think this is a very appropriate way of looking at a lot of what Sergio Leone has done. So my hypothesis in what I'm going to try to share with you about thoughts about genre and Sergio Leone is that first and foremost, Sergio Leone is a modernist filmmaker. Genre is a nice thing to think with. We always think in genres when we watch films or read literature or go to the art galleries and see pictures or listen to music. We think in genres. Regardless of whether we want to or not, we think in genres. And let us then try to think a bit more about what is a genre. Etymologically, genre comes from the same roots as gender, genus. The genders between man and woman, it's a way of saying something about kind, sort, etc. And genres, before anything else, was something that was being used in relation to literature, and from there on it moved to other art forms, including the cinema, when the cinema came into being. When we think about the cinema, and when we think about literature, and we think about other arts and literature and the cinema have, so to say, they have two sides. They are part of an institution, and sociologically speaking, institutions always have two elements. They have a material elements, and in the cinema, that is the production system and everything that has to do with that, the financing, the screening, the distribution, everything like that. But institutions also have an immaterial side, and those areas are the normative sides of institutions. That's where aesthetic norms are being played out. That's where we have morals in relation to that. And genres are a very important part, or maybe the essential part, of the normative side of the institution of cinema, or literature for that matter of fact. When we talk about cinema, and when we talk about literature, and when we talk about how these elements came into being, these forms of art came into being, we always try to register this in some main categories, which we may call the main registers of an art form in literature. There are the registers of lyrics, poetry, of narrative, of dramatic, and many other genres that are sort of playing on the interrelationship between these three main registers. And there are always plays, the playing of the interrelationship between the registers that make for new forms, new genres to develop, or combination. And that again leads to the development of subgenres. For instance, in relation to the poetic register, there is the ode, there's the sonnet, etc., etc. The narrative register, we have the novel, the short story, the epic, not to talk about the epic, and the fairy tale. All of what makes genres into genres are that there are some fixed marks that we recognize immediately when we see them. When we see a Western, we know it's a Western. Not only because of the horses, but also because there are some elements that are being sort of say the absolute recognizable element of a Western. And we can talk about landscapes. Western landscapes may be dry and arid, as the ones we see in Sergio Leone's Westerns, but they might also be filled with snow, and as in Cheyenne Autumn. The problem is not what they look like, but what they feel like and what we recognize. And that is one of the tricks about the genre. We recognize genres. We enter into a contract with the book we read or with the film we see, and the contract is about recognizing the genre. And then to see that, I could go on listing all the subgenres of the film, starting with a Western, going on with the gangster movie, the comedy, and then the two forms of comedy, the character comedy, the action comedy, etc., etc., the musical, not to talk about that. I'm not going to do that, because you all know what it is. You all, immediately when you come into a theater like this, you know, and you've seen the title, maybe read a little bit about the film beforehand, you know what kind of genre you're going to expect. But sometimes you get shocked by what you see, because the expectations you had are not being fulfilled by what you see. The conventions of the genre are being broken. And that is part of the trick with some of the great films that stick to the genre but break the conventions of the genre. And I think Sergio Leone is a great example of exactly doing that. When we come to the genre, when we come to, for instance, a film like Sergio Leone's, there is something that you always think when you watch Sergio Leone film, and it starts with the one we just saw. And that is something that is, in my opinion, one of the areas where it really breaks with the conventions of the Western. Because when you ask, watching a Sergio Leone film, you will ask, who really speaks to you here? Who's the narrator? In ordinary Westerns, it's the non-subjective, the objective narrator which stands there and sort of shows you the history, like in a third person novel. That's not the case for Sergio Leone's films. There's always a narrator, a point of view that you really can't fix. The film you're going to see after this, is it harmonica who's the narrator? Or who's really telling the story? Or is it Jill? Or is it Cheyenne? Which of these characters have the sympathy that follows with being the narration, the point of narration in the film? And even more so, it's the case for that in what I regard as his absolute masterpiece, which we couldn't show because it's so long, namely Once Upon a Time in America. It's one of the greatest films in film history. And it's a place where it has an apparent first-person narrator in the form of Noodles, but suddenly that is being broken. So we really don't know from which point this film is being told. And that is one of the first elements when you watch a genre film and you start feeling uneasy. It's because suddenly the elements that make for the film's narration is being broken. And that is what Leone does all the time. The most elementary form of a narrative contract is what you have in the traditional stories or in traditional epics. In the traditional stories, you have it way, way back to the beginning of the history, and also to way, way back to the beginning of the story, when men and women sat around the fire and someone started telling a story, once upon a time. Then it starts. Or like it starts in the Iliad, sing-song goddess about the gods and the men and the events at the walls of Troy. You call upon someone to tell you something, and that is where the genre starts. And one of the reasons why I think the title of the Norwegian version, so the two last films, so Sergio Leone, the one which we are going to see Once Upon a Time in the West, and Once Upon a Time in America, where they called it Und Vesten und i Amerika. Bad blood in the West, bad blood in America. Those who have put those titles to those films haven't understood one word about what the films are about. They think it's about elementary principles of bad against good, etc. It's not about that. It's about telling a story. Once upon a time. And then the story unfolds. All stories and narratives are to a certain degree also related to the drama. And the film is of course the art form together with the theater, the opera, where you combine the narrative and the dramatic. And in many ways, Sergio Leone, being an Italian, has learned a lot from the opera. His films are operatic in their grand gestures, in the way that passions are being played out and subdued at the same time, which is like in the opera, in the grand operas. And also in dramas, in the great dramas that we have from back to the Greeks, actually. There are always plots and subplots. And in Sergio Leone's films, there is the main plot, but then suddenly there are all these other subplots that come in and often are not being dissolved. You don't find a solution. What really happened to that little family that walked away from the man with no name in the film that we just saw? All narration is about how to construct a conflict and then how to dissolve it. But what happens when you don't dissolve it? That is when the modern movement and modern moment sets in. And in Sergio Leone's, particularly his last films, there is no dissolution of the conflict. It is there, it has apparently been solved, but it continues. So all narratives are about solving the mystery. It's about solving the riddle about what is being positioned at the start of the film. And finding the solution, however dissatisfactory, is what is the end of the film. It's to try to solve the suspense. But when the suspense is not really dissolved, then we sit back again with an uneasy feeling. And that uneasy feeling you will feel at the end of Once Upon a Time in the West. Because it all continues in some way or other. Genres always intervenes between the individual text and the mainstream register of the narrative, dramatic, or poetic form. Genre is the link, the bridge between the text and the register. And it's the format which sort of creates a bridge from us, the spectators, the readers of this individual text, to the kind of presuppositions we have in our heads when we read or watch something. We move from the individual text to the system. And that element, the movement between the individual text and the system, that is where we recognize and move into the film or the text we read. The genre film fills the gap between the individual text and the system. Of course, the first person in the world, the first theoretician about genre, was of course Aristotle in his famous Poetics. And there he made, of course, the famous distinction between what is the difference between drama and comedy. No, tragedy and comedy, sorry. But he also made another very, very important point, two more important points. He said that all plots, I don't like this English translation of mythos into plot, but that's the way it's being translated. He said the plot, the mythos, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Very simple, but very profound. The question is, how do we bring something from the beginning till the end? That is the secret. How do we start a film and how do we end the film? Actually, my favorite opening of any film is not any Sergio Leone film, but it's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Milos Forman. Have you seen how that film starts? With a car coming from the very, very distance and coming closer and closer and closer. And that car, of course, contains the one who's going to create havoc in the whole story. The one who is the cuckoo's egg who's being dropped in the cuckoo's nest. Right? But Sergio Leone has almost the same knack in some of his films, and particularly look at the opening of Once Upon a Time in the West. This is also an opening which is absolutely spectacular, because you don't know how he's going to bring this story to the end, and then the end is not really an end. So that is also part of what Aristotle tried to say. And then, of course, the third point, that Aristotle made was that the plot is not the story. The question is, how do you put the story, the plot, into a story? How do you narrate the plot? And the plot may be simple, but the way you narrate it is the secret. And genres are about how to play on the mixture between the story, which is the structure, and the way you tell it, which is the story. And all stories have this axis, the narrative axis and the metaphorical axis, right? And that is how you work it, and that's how you also work with the characters. And characters are, as you all know, three aspects in all narration and also in all dramas. Characters, as we see them, they are part of the way the plot is constructed. And there are 6 main types of that. It's the hero, it's the object of desire, it's the helper, it's the enemy, and it's the sender, and it's the receiver. There are 6. They are the potential parts of it. But then there is also the role. The role in a film is the hero, for instance, or maybe the father, or maybe the villain, or the gunman with the black hat, or the hero with the white hat. And then, of course, it's the acteur, which also means those who are invested with psychology. And the investing of psychology into roles and actential elements, that is one of the most important elements in how you fulfill genre expectations or not. And what kind of psychological characters do you really meet in Sergio Leone's films? Many of my friends tend to read films and read history and read literature by saying that, what did he mean by doing so, and what happened afterwards? And I often answers to these questions, well, that we can't know because it's not in the way the film has been told. We don't know where Nora went after the end of The Doll's House by Ibsen. We don't know where the harmonica rides after Once Upon a Time in the West. We don't know what he thinks because he utters very, very little about his thoughts. So we invest our thoughts into these characters. And that's also part of how we expect genres to fulfill our expectations, but they don't always do that. So to make films and write literature without really psychological characters is a really difficult thing to do, because we always invest the fictional characters with psychology. The question is, do Sergio Leone's characters really have a psychology? Even in Once Upon a Time in West, do they really have a psychology? Or is the psychology which we invest in them, what is the psychology? Very difficult to say. Because what they utter, what they express, is very little about psychology. It's about what they observe. Sergio Leone's characters don't talk about their inner beings. They talk about what they observe. There is a sort of break with that in the film we just saw, when he's being asked by the little family, why do you do this? Because you remind me of someone I once met. But that's a very rare moment. It's not like that. Of course, they also point to their psychology by acting, like in the end of Once Upon a Time in the West, when Frank gets the harmonica put into his mouth. But that's not an expression, that's an action. And Sergio Leone's characters, they act, they don't speak about what's happening inside them. Sergio Leone is, in my opinion, as I said, belongs to a great tradition in art. It belongs to the great modernist tradition. And the modernist tradition is always about using well-known previous literary forms with expectations and then breaking with them and doing something else with them. Maybe the most famous example of all in literature is Ulysses by James Joyce, which is based on Ulysses by Homer. But in so many of the great modernist arts of literature, it's about using the accepted old traditional forms and stories and plots and remaking them and breaking with the expectations that the genre have in them. I also do think that it's something that is true also for the great examples of when tradition, literary tradition or artistic tradition, so to say, change its skin. Let us take maybe the world's most famous dramatic play, Hamlet, which I think is deeply related to Once Upon a Time in the West. Hamlet is a revenge tragedy. Like many other revenge tragedies that were written at the same time as Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. And Once Upon a Time is a revenge story, very much so. And in all revenge stories, the question is, does the protagonist get this revenge or not? Does he in Once Upon a Time in the West? Yes and no. Did Hamlet get his revenge? Yes and no. The story of the revenge is one of the most fundamental stories in the Western, but also in world literature and also in many, much modern literature. As I said, genres are there to serve as a strict formula to be broken by the great individual artists who manage to create something new within the strict framework of the old. And I think that Sergio Leone has managed to do that. And of course, genres they possess ideology. Many of the, let's take the example of the comedy. The traditional comedy starts with order being broken and ends with order being restored. In a traditional whodunit, a traditional detective story, and a traditional crime story, there might be order that has been broken, but at the end, law is victorious. Law and order is being restored. But what happens if that does not happen at the end? That is when the real question of how do you break the ideology of the genre comes up. There is something about the relationship between great directors in film and the genre system. This is something that was brought up, of course, by the great proponents of auteur theory in France. who wrote about how the great directors within the studio system who worked in the genres managed to put their individual imprint on the films that they made, like John Ford, Hitchcock, Howard Hawks, Douglas Sirk, etc., etc. Sergio Leone is, in my opinion, an auteur, but he's a different type of auteur because he didn't work within the studio system, or really not in the genre system. He let the genre system work for him, which is opposite from what the traditional Hollywood auteurs did. They worked within the genre system. They were told to make a Western, or a film noir, or a gangster movie. But Leone decided to make a Western. That's a different way of looking at it. So he didn't really work with he chose the genres for himself, not the opposite. The genre didn't choose him. Or maybe the genre did choose him because he found them fascinating. There's always something about the genres that have an iconography that you always recognize, like I said, horses in a Western film, the suits in a gangster film. The question is how you use the iconography of a genre and how you break with it. The question of difference and repetition. And difference and repetition is also one of the really, really interesting parts of the genre film. And that again is related to intertextuality. All genre films quote from previous films. There are always quotes. And in Sergio Leone's films, there are so many quotes. Many of them are just, sort of the kind of intertextual quotes that you say, well, I recognize that, I've seen that somewhere else. But sometimes the quotes are also, in a way, quotes that speak against the tradition. And one of my absolute favorites in relation to that is the clock in Once Upon a Time in the West. There is a clock which at one time do not show the right time. Sometimes it's a half clock and sometimes it's a clock without arms. And this is of course a quote from one of the most famous westerns ever made, namely High Noon, where the clock exemplifies when the good guy is going to win in the end and the order is going to be restored and the morals of society are going to be like they were before they were broken by the bandits who are supposed to come to town. Here, the order is not being restored. The clock continues to be without arms. The clock is out of sync. And obviously the clock is much more than just a clock. The clock is maybe one of the most important symbols of civilization, modern civilization. It's the regimentation of time. Very, very important. During the Paris Commune, the communards shot at the clocks in the bell towers because their regimentation of time was the start of the new way of organizing labor. So the clock as a symbol is a very telling symbol, and it's very important that it is in Once Upon a Time in the West. Leone's films belong to these two genres, which in my opinion is one of the most important film genres in American cinema, namely the Western, which is about America talking to itself about its past and mythological history, and the attempt to restore a past that is before the coming of modern civilization, but the modern civilization comes whether you like it or not. And in the Western there's always this conflict, this thematic conflict, this opposition between civilization and nature, which is of course also one of the elements of our way of thinking of our situation, civilization versus nature. In the Western, the coming of civilization is always exemplified by the coming of the railway, and the railway comes here. The other genre, which is about America talking to itself, it's the gangster film, which is about urban history and presence and the technology of a new alienated world, and where the question is, what is the moral in this world? Both the Western and the gangster film is about the relationship between order and law, morals and law. And the question is, when society is not on the side of morals, but on the side of a law that is crooked. And that is the result of which you do, or the conclusion you will draw from watching Once Upon a Time in the West and Once Upon a Time in America. Law is not on the side of moral, society is not on the side of moral. What kind of society is it then? Leone is a deeply cynical director. He doesn't really believe in anything. As we heard in the first lecture today, there were a number of other directors at the time of Leone when they made spaghetti western with the revolutionary message. Sergio Leone is a critique of capitalism, but he doesn't believe in revolution. And in the film about the revolution, Duck You Sucker, the revolutionaries are as evil as the contra-revolutionaries. They also execute people, mass executions. Sergio Leone's films are deeply cynical, and that is part of their fascination. There is a problem, of course, with the films of Sergio Leone, and that is that they are extremely violent. And then the question is, how can we watch with such pleasure all this violence? Let me also, by the way, say that if there is one thing that Sergio Leone is not a feminist filmmaker. But he has a fascination, or he shows a fascination with violence. But what is this fascination with violence? This is something that is part of the long tradition of the basic narratives that we have and that we have grown up with. Think of the violence in the tales, the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. Think of the violence in the Icelandic sagas. Think of the violence in Ulysses by Homer, when Ulysses comes back and the pleasure with which he slaughters the suitors of his wife Penelope. There is the fantasy of violence which is being played out in Sergio Leone's films. And it's not pleasant, but it's part of us, and it's part of the genre of the fairy tale. In a way, I think that, as I said, Sergio Leone is a great modernist filmmaker, but at the same time, he also belongs to the most traditional of filmmakers by quoting back and turning back on one of the basic genres of all times, the one which is the romance, which was the quest for finding a solution to a riddle which does not have a solution, and which always starts with the following beginning, and which is also related to rituals. There's something extremely ritualistic about the killings in Sergio Leone's films. The final of The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, the trio in the churchyard, it's like a dance of the ritual of death. And his films start like all great stories have started. Sarà una volta. Once upon a time. Det var en gang.